Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's show. We have a fantastic slate of segments ahead for you. We begin today's show with some segments about some college football player profiles. In fact, every single segment will be a college football player profile, whether it be an established veteran, a breakout star from last year, what have you. We have you covered in every single department. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. We appreciate all your guys' support, especially in that department. Anything you do for the channel and the network is greatly appreciated. And if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. This will change in the future, as I will change to a live show, so you can make yourselves available to all the super chat, super thanks, and super stickers that YouTube has to offer, and we will be presenting them on the show. I would love to get your input, especially as a fantasy show, as we get closer to fantasy football drafts and things of that nature. So if you do feel so inclined, you can make yourselves available to that. But as of right now, gsmc.cloud is the link where all things can happen. But without further ado, let's jump right into today's show, shall we? Do have 5 fantastic players to highlight here, and we don't have any time to waste with them, do we? I do want to appreciate all of them. I think that this group of players is very unique in that each and every single one of them feels like they have a point to prove. It feels like this is their pivotal season to make everything seem right for themselves in their careers. Not saying that they haven't had fantastic years yet, but this definitely feels like a make it or break it year for all of them. Let's start off with perhaps the one under the most pressure out of all of them, a wide receiver playing in the shadow of one of the great college football wide receivers of the past 2 years. Now, finally getting the chance to prove that he himself deserves to be a wide receiver one. So let's get right into the fantasy player profile of Mr. Emeka Egbuka. Like I said, playing in the shadow of someone like Marvin Harrison Jr. definitely feels as if it limits you in so many departments, but Emeka Egbuka really shined through with ease in terms of being that supplementary piece that Ohio State needed. However, it never really came to fruition. The duo never did really reach the heights they wanted to. And in fact, they missed the playoffs entirely last year, and they didn't make any noise in the playoffs the year before outside of, making a close game against Georgia. They really want to win. And if Emeka Egbuka doesn't win, I'm not sure you could call that a failure, but it certainly would be a huge disappointment in his career, especially considering the fact that now is finally his time to be wide receiver one. And so, thinking about the whole landscape of what he meant and what he means now to Ohio State football is that if he truly is a wide receiver one, then this kid perhaps can be the best wide receiver in college football and fantasy college football because he plays for Ohio State and because he wants to be the wide receiver one right now. And a talented wide receiver group that's only real caveat is that they're young. I'm looking for Emeka Egbuka to truly be a leader in this setup. Without further ado, let's jump right into his stats and what makes him truly stand out. In 2022, his first kind of big year when he came onto the national scene, 1,151 yards and 10 TDs. Only 515 yards last year and 4 TDs, but of course, they were always looking for Marvin Harrison Jr. to be that guy. Kyle McCord really developed a relationship with him, and this year, Will Howard gets Emeka Egbuka all to himself. His best game last year, as we can see, in terms of his topsy-turvy year last year, was only 19.7 points against Western Kentucky, where he had 2 touchdowns but only on 4 catches and 57 yards. His worst was 1.7, where he only had 1 catch for 20 receptions. However, like I said before, no matter how people brand this Ohio State wide receiver room, it is still very young. No matter how much they like it on paper, it has to translate onto the field, and Emeka Egbuka will be a big part of that because outside of tight end Cade Stover, he is the only returnee to this roster and to this offense, really. He's the only player who has had experience, knows Ohio State football, knows what they want, and knows the goals they are trying to achieve. So that perhaps could be to his benefit. It's definitely to Will Howard's benefit to have someone who already knows the system so that he can get eased into it and be comfortable in the system come the time when there are games that are more do or die later in the year. And so when I think about Emeka Egbuka, I think about those two very contrasting seasons I just described, the one in 2022 where he had a big moment, and then last year where, he kind of fell flat. I definitely feel as if it can't necessarily all be attributed to him if, one of the best wide receivers in college football just wants to get open and wants to get fed the football. And so I don't necessarily think it's his fault that he hasn't had the breakout year outside of 2022, but 2024 to 25 definitely feels like it can be a repeat of 22, if not even a better season than 2022. And I'm not saying that this wide receiver core can step up and really, make Egbuka work for every kind of target he gets, because this wide receiver group, it has the speed now with Jeremiah Smith. Carnell Tate, the rumors I'm hearing about him is that he's a very handsy wide receiver, very fantastic route runner, very good at the point of attack. And so, while I definitely think that Emeka Egbuka could be pushed in terms of who gets the most targets out of this offense, because Will Howard's coming into this with a blank slate. He doesn't owe anybody anything, and he's just coming into this fresh and ready to go with a mentality to win. So he doesn't necessarily have that rapport already established with Emeka Egbuka, whereas Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate are also new to this culture. So maybe that leads to their benefit as well. But it definitely does help that Emeka Egbuka has had experience in the system. It definitely helps that he had a fantastic year in the system already. And most importantly, I feel like Ryan Day wants him to be the leader of this offense. It's not all about the glitz and the glamour that Smith and Tate bring. It's not all about the excitement. It's about experience. And for Ohio State this year, they need more experience than ever. I definitely feel that when you look at their schedule, there's a real possibility that they can go either undefeated or lose at least 2 games. Those 2 games everyone knows, Oregon and Michigan. I believe they're at Oregon, and this year they are home against Michigan. So, as you can see, Ohio State should be expecting to win all their games, leaving their focus, most importantly, on those games against Oregon and Michigan. Because those are the 2 contenders in the Big Ten that could knock off Ohio State, that could really knock them out of the picture entirely, perhaps. I think that at this moment they should be favored against Michigan because Michigan does have a lot of questions. That being said, I think that the Michigan defense is perhaps the best in the country. A lot of returnees. You have Mason Graham, Will Johnson, things of that nature. And they're very well rounded. And I think that Jerome Moore will carry over the principles that Jim Harbaugh set forth. I know that there are still some loose ends to tie up with their case. I won't go into that. So, Ohio State should feel as if right now they're not necessarily, weakened as Ohio State. And then you look, as Michigan. When you look at Oregon, on the other hand, that's a very even matchup. You have 2 transfer QBs, Will Howard and Dylan Gabriel. You have these well-rounded receiving cores. But you also have the sense that if you lose this game, while it's not as important in the whole landscape of the 12-team CFP because you feel like you'll get an at-large bid, it certainly will feel as if you let down your team. And so both of these squads going into that game will feel as if this is a can't-lose situation for them. They cannot afford to feel as if in a huge game that could decide the Big 12 title hopes of both of these teams, that you have to step up. And when it matters most, the only receiver who I feel in that entirety of both of those receiver rooms has the ability to step up at any given time is Ibuka. I mean, I talked about Tez Johnson before, but Tez Johnson to me feels like someone who is willing to, just play the role of wide receiver one and also have everyone incorporated. Emeka Ibuka is a guy who, if Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, aren't up to speed and aren't as challenged as they were, then he's the one who has to drag this whole system along, and he's the one that at the end of the day can carry this team through thick and thin. And so, in terms of fantasy, I would say Emeka Ibuka isn't necessarily a boomer bust guy, but he definitely is someone to be very careful about, because there will be games where it's definitely going to be kind of a forced narrative, if I may, where Will Howard's going to be trying a lot of different things, and a lot of different things will be going on, and so there might be some chaotic moments where Emeka Ibuka, isn't necessarily receiving as much attention as other players in this system. And at the end of the day, he's good for at least 6 to 7 solid games where you're like, okay, this guy is a wide receiver one. Because the bottom line is, all the receivers in college football should feel as if they have a point to prove it. And Emeka Ibuka is the only one who has the pressure and the knowledge to overcome and understand both, if that makes any sense. And I believe in him to eventually be the wide receiver one in fantasy college football. Now, just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we have one of Emeka Ibuka's teammates that we're going to be talking about. This time, he is going to reside in the backfield. We'll be right back to talk about him after the break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into the second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you guys yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and the network. Also, since I am going to become a live show, you might want to make yourselves available to all the ways you can communicate with me through super chat, super thanks, and super stickers, because I do want to get you guys input. You are a huge part of the show, and I do want to get your opinions on certain things, especially as we get closer and closer to the start of fantasy football. But without further ado, let's stick in the realm of college fantasy football for the time being, and let's talk about Emeka Ibuka's teammate, another guy with a lot of experience in this Ohio State offense, another guy who's looking to have a huge role and say in this system. And that is, of course, in the backfield, Mr. Travion Henderson. Now, when we think about college football running backs, they either are good at one or two things. One being that they're either a very explosive runner, and two being that they're a workhorse runner. TreVeyon Henderson is the only running back I can really think of who combines both traits so well, and most importantly, knows his role in the system and knows that he's going to get some carries, but he's also not necessarily going to be the focal point of everything that Ohio State does. And also, health has always been a big concern. So while he's a very well-rounded, balanced running back, that's a perfect fit for any fantasy squad. He also has missed a lot of games. In fact, last year he missed 4 games. But on 156 carries, he garnered 926 yards for 11 touchdowns. He also added 229 receiving yards to that total. But overall, outside of those 4 games, he missed 7 games in the past 2 years. So you really have to weigh your options here. Because TreVeyon Henderson is one of the more remarkable running backs we've seen in recent years because he has so much power, but he also has a lot of explosiveness combined with that. He can grind out runs, and he can break them out too. And so I'm really excited to see. Let's talk about his best fantasy games. Best was against Wisconsin, 28.7 points, 24 carries, 162 yards, and 1 touchdown. His worst was against Indiana, only 4.7 points, 12 carries, 47 yards, 0 touchdowns. So I feel like while TreVeyon Henderson perhaps could be the best running back in fantasy college football this year, it also varies on the necessity he brings. How necessary is he to what your game plan is going to be against certain teams? I feel as if, Ohio State, their early schedule isn't as tough, their non-conference schedule especially. And so perhaps TreVeyon Henderson will not get as many touches. Perhaps they'll want to focus on developing a rapport between Will Howard, who's a new transfer quarterback, and the new receivers, and also making sure that Emeka Egbuka gets a lot of love because at the end of the day, he deserves to be the wide receiver 1. So TreVeyon Henderson, while I'm not calling him a footnote, certainly fits more of like a cog in the machine than, say, the top star, the star, the cherry on top of everything. I think that in terms of deciding whether or not you pick him for your fantasy college football team, really comes down to value. It really comes down to schedule. So if I'm looking at Ohio State's schedule, right, I'm only looking at really 2 games where a lot of things can come into play and stats will really matter. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is almost every team in college football will have a pretty easy game. I guarantee it. No matter what conference they're in, they'll always have an easy game. And Ohio State, especially in their non-conference scheduling, always look to schedule easy, kind of cupcake games to kind of settle themselves into the season before they get into the stretch where things matter. And so, if you value, a running back who probably will get a lot of touches early in the season, then I think that TreVeyon Henderson might just fit that mold, but he also might be needed in more important games because at the end of the day, looking at Ohio State and how they profile, I can't guarantee that this team will be successful on the field. There just seems to be a lot of parts coming in and not a lot of parts that have already been there. It seems like this is more of an unsolved puzzle than a final product. It feels as if TreVeyon Henderson is more of the sum of a small whole of things instead of, someone who, can actually add value to a team that needs it. I feel like if you consider TreVeyon Henderson as surplus, then that's where his value is lost. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is, when you consider running backs, especially in college football, there's not going to be, as quote-unquote a big of a drop-off as you would expect in, say, the NFL, because in NFL you have a lot more top end talent because there's just more and more young talent coming in who's unproven. And in college, the parity is so overwhelming because you have these excellent running backs, and you have these excellent running backs in the group of five. You have these excellent running backs who might not ever heard of, and they have breakout seasons. So, looking for someone who defines the role of fantasy college football running back, is very especially hard to do, because not every day are you going to be confident that a college football running back will always be successful. You basically have blind faith. When I think about TreVeyon Henderson, I certainly feel as if all the aspects of what makes college football and fantasy college football, for that matter, lie within him. He always has the ability to do whatever is needed at the running back position for his team. He's always going to be in and around the debate about how we're going to make this offense work. But this year just feels different because the questions surrounding Ohio State, while there are certainly positive rumors, there are always going to be questions, especially if this Ohio State team does not gel immediately. And TreVeyon Henderson, well, he fits a certain kind of profile. Does he fit Ohio State's profile for what they want to do this year? And in all reality, Quinshon Judkins is perhaps the guy who's going to get most of the carries this year. TreVeyon Henderson does seem to be kind of an afterthought. But the hope and silver lining in what TreVeyon Henderson brings is, well, I can be a guy who doesn't always have to play every single snap, but every snap that I play matters. I'm kind of thinking of, say, a Reggie Bush, Lendell White situation where there's a lot of different scenarios where either one or another or both of them are on the field. And sometimes it didn't work out, as we saw, to my benefit as I'm a Texas fan, but no more. That kind of system could come in handy for Ohio State if they play their cards right. Because Quinshon Judkins is a star, TreVeyon Henderson is more of a solid player. He fits, like I said, the profile of what you want. If you're more of someone who likes the big flashy stats, if you're intrigued by the big flashy stats, then by all means, go for a Quinshon Judkins, go for an Ollie Gordon. But there are guys out there who kind of feel more important to their squads. And those are the guys who have been with them through thick or thin. TreVeyon Henderson could have transferred. He could have gone somewhere else once Quinshon Judkins came in. But he chose to stay because he said, hey, I see the potential that this team could have, and I could be a huge part of that. And the thing is, that's what every quarterback wants. Well, Will Howard will be pleased to have someone like Quinshon Judkins in the backfield because it alleviates some of the burden he has in terms of what he brings to the passing game. It also allows for him to kind of calm down, and relax within a setup that works for him. He doesn't always have to be this guns a-blazing quarterback that, has to bring it every single week. He can be a guy who supplements this offense and is serviceable. When I look at the two players who I talked about, Habuka and Henderson, they have very little runway right now to fully be stars because they're heading into the twilight years of their college careers and they want to go into the NFL. The reason why I think that these are make or break seasons for them, though, is that if they're the best players in this Ohio State team, let's say, then that's a testament to the character they developed for Ohio State, because right now Ohio State should be all about developing the character of these players and developing a rapport that will carry over into the future if they really want to truly make themselves a Big Ten contender for years to come. And while Ibuka and Henderson, like I said, aren't going to be a part of that process, this season, experience will matter for Ohio State. More importantly than any other team in college football I can think of. Because so much pressure is on everyone else. But you forget about the players in-house. You forget about the pressure they might have. You forget about the careers they might have. And so these two players, while not necessarily the most exciting fantasy prospects, are guys that you definitely want to have on your team because the name of the game is experience. And Travion Henderson and Emeka Egbuka, for that matter, bring that in spades. That's about to do it for this segment. Coming next, we switch from a cemented, experienced wide receiver and running back for Ohio State to a transfer wide receiver for one of the SEC's newcomers. You definitely don't want to miss this segment because I love this guy. I love talking about him. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed my first two segments of the day. I really love talking about these established Ohio State veterans who really have a point to prove, and perhaps a point to prove to you as fantasy college football managers in terms of really being big stars. But our third segment is perhaps going to be the most exciting, hyped up segment of the day because I'm talking about a player, a transfer wide receiver that I truly love, coming to Texas, coming to the newest SEC member, one of them at the very least. And this guy I have very high hope for. One of the most exciting perimeter receivers in college football. One of the best deep threats in all of college football. I am, of course, talking about Isaiah Bond. What I love about what Texas did this past offseason is that they could have looked at all the production they left and gone, well, you know, we certainly have a lot of holes to fill, but we do want to kind of continue the momentum we got. No, they didn't rest on their laurels and say, hey, this kind of in-house project we built last year works. They went out and got transfer portal additions, and Isaiah Bond was the big get for them. And I don't think he will let the Texas faithful down. He's an apt replacement for whatever production they left. He's an apt replacement for A.D. Mitchell, an apt replacement for Xavier Worthy, and I think that Quinn Ewers will immediately love him for what he brings vertically, because that is what Texas is all about. They're about really picking you apart downfield. And Isaiah Bond, while he definitely hasn't had a season as a wide receiver one, and there's going to be a lot of pressure and burden upon him, I do believe that he will rise to the challenge on a new team, in a new kind of approach to things, a new team in a new conference, most importantly, that wants to make a statement. And Isaiah Bond is a player that wants to make a statement. Let's talk about what brought Isaiah Bond to Texas and what skills and traits he brings that really intrigue and also to really help you make a decision about what wide receivers you want. Like I said before, Texas lost its top 5 pass catchers in their offense, and for that matter, they just lost C.J. Baxter, their presumptive starting running back, for the season due to an ACL injury. So now, every single offensive player really has to step up their game, because a lot of the Texas offense was kind of predicated on these big physical rushers wearing your defensive front down, thus allowing Quinn Ewers more time in the pocket to hit the ball downfield. So we're going to have to see how that changes the dynamics of this Texas offense. But like I said, Isaiah Bond should be a big part of that. 668 yards last year, 4 TDs on 77 targets. This, of course, for Alabama. His best game was against Texas A&M, 19-1.7 catches and 96 yards, 1 touchdown. His worst game was against Ole Miss, where he didn't get that many targets, only 1 catch for 51 yards. And the big question surrounding, for that matter, everyone on the Texas offense, but especially Isaiah Bond, can he really be a wide receiver 1? Who is going to be the wide receiver 1 for this Texas team? And while I like to say Isaiah Bond is, I think this is a very by committee wide receiver room, which we don't often see in football that often, where your wide receiver room is so well balanced that you don't really have a quote-unquote wide receiver 1. And I look at the Texas receivers they brought into the portal outside of Bond, guys like Matthew Golden from Houston, Silas Bolden from Oregon State. They both profile as very savvy kind of football players at the wide receiver position. They profile as route runners. They profile as guys who are intelligent. They can make certain reads, run certain routes to the T. But when I look at Isaiah Bond, what makes him so special is that he, out of all of them, was in a system where he also didn't necessarily feel like a wide receiver 1 whenever you saw him play. He more so felt like someone who profiled as a gadget kind of receiver, if that makes a little bit of sense, where he could line up on the perimeter because that was where he felt most comfortable, and just, kind of make of that what you will kind of player, if that makes sense. He was a kind of player who didn't necessarily always have to go to, but he was always there as that deep threat. And that's what I feel like he could bring to Texas. But the reason why I'm calling him the wide receiver 1, the presumptive wide receiver 1, is that when I look at what Texas did last year, when they had 2 guys who had very similar profiles, 2 guys that could take the top off the defense, they concerned themselves with finding ways in certain situations to allow those traits where both A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy were very similar to kind of branch away from each other. For example, A.D. Mitchell, I feel like, became more of a red zone target because in shorter situations where the field was shorter, he was more of a good route runner. In open field, you had Xavier Worthy running a couple more routes than usual because he's someone who has that yards after catch kind of speed. In this setup, now you have more of a 2 true route runner kind of situation with Golden and Bolden, and then you have Isaiah Bond as your main vertical threat. So it kind of plays out perfectly when you think about it, due to the affinity for Steve Sarkisian to, while wanting to take the top off the defense, he also wants to create kind of timing situations for Quinn Ewers, because Quinn Ewers, he wants to always stay on schedule with his throws. There's a tempo to the Texas offense that they want to employ, and the utmost importance is that Quinn Ewers is comfortable with that tempo. So the situations where I feel like Texas can be very successful is if, the run game is going, and that's a very big if now. Let's see if Jaden Blue can carry that load. But also by assuming the role of anticipatory kind of QB, because that's what's going to take in the SEC, and that's what it's going to take to really get all of these new receivers implemented. Whereas Ohio State has Ibuka and Henderson to fall back on, Texas doesn't really have that guy. So Isaiah Bond, I certainly feel as if is going to have a lot of pressure to do that. But I also feel like a lot of the rhythm of the Texas offense suits him, because he's not always going to be, the main target. When Texas is driving, they're going to pick and choose their moments to attack the defense. And that's where Isaiah Bond is the most useful weapon. And in terms of fantasy, how that translates stats-wise, well, he may only be good for about 5 to 10 catches a game, but all of those catches will be for important yardage. All of those catches add up, and all those targets add up as well. And Isaiah Bond's catch radius is also remarkable. We saw it in that game against Auburn when he had that remarkable touchdown. We see it when he gets more vertical. And that's important because, early on in their careers, well, more so Xavier Worthy than A.D. Mitchell, they were worried about drops. And so you need kind of a vertical threat who you're comfortable if you're Quinn Ewers throwing the football on the field and him running into the space and making that contested catch. And so when I try and compare Texas wide receiver room to other wide receiver rooms, I really can't. Because you never really know who might get the lion's share of the targets, because I feel like Steven Sarkisian values verticality and he values going for the home run. But what I saw from the Texas offense last year really was very exciting in terms of the verbiage it created. It was a very complex system with a lot of moving parts. And while it certainly seemed that could be the detriment to Quinn Ewers and what he's capable of, it also adds the factor of unpredictability and the ability for these newer receivers to feel more comfortable. Because while it's cliche to say that unpredictability breeds success, that's what I think Texas is going for. They're heading into the SEC. They want to make noise. They feel as if they can really challenge Georgia for that SEC title. And when I think about the way that Steve Sarkisian attacked the portal and diagnosed the players he wanted, I feel as if the Texas offense this year is going to predicate itself on variation, unpredictability, and the element of surprise. And while that might puzzle a lot of college football fans, especially my fellow Texas fans, it all works out, I feel, in a way where every single player in this offense, most importantly Quinn Ewers, feels very comfortable. Because the big question surrounding Quinn Ewers was his inconsistencies. And if there's a tempo, yet also a mixture of surprise added in, then that could allow Quinn Ewers to feel comfortable, like saying, okay, we're developing a nice tempo, but I have this play in my back pocket that I can unleash on the defense at any given moment. And that's what I feel like Isaiah Bond comes in. He's not your typical wide receiver one, and I want to establish that. He's not your typical wide receiver one because I'm not sure if he's going to be the most savvy route runner on this Texas team. But his wild card potential, his potential to do so many different things, wear so many different hats for this Texas offense, really comes into play when you consider the fact that they might need that at any given moment in the season. What's the contingency plan if Texas kind of falls flat? Do you really think you have the depth outside of Golden and Bolden in terms of route running? Because you have a guy in Ryan Wingo who's a freshman, but he's not proven. I like Amari Nyablack as a tight end, but I don't necessarily think he adds much value outside of, route running. So Isaiah Bond certainly feels as if his role in this offense can be more integral than people expect. And so the unpredictability factor is going to be a key aspect of what to watch in terms of deciphering whether or not Isaiah Bond truly is capable of being a wide receiver one. And I think that he is, at the end of the day, going to be Quinn Ewers' favorite target. But it's going to be in a way where Quinn Ewers knows that he has the defense beat. Because Isaiah Bond feels like the final chess piece to what Steve Sarkisian is building here. He went out, got Golden and Bolden, and views Bond as someone who can take the top off the defense. And that's very pivotal to what that means in terms of fantasy as well. And make of it what you will. Well, that's about to do it for this segment. Come next, we have an exceptional young QB that with a breakout season last year looking to take over the ACC this year. Can he do it? You'll find out right after the break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are now in the home stretch of today's show, and these next two segments rather, are about two quarterbacks in drastically different situations in their college careers. The first one we're going to talk about is one who has cemented himself as a breakout star and potentially one of the most exciting young prospects to follow in all of college football, and the other, to end out our show, is a guy who is on his third school in the past 3 years, really looking to find some consistency and development in his college career. Let's start off with the more exciting prospect here. This guy, I really love the hype surrounding him. I really think that the ACC really needs a guy like him, especially in a time where Florida State and Clemson could be leaving if other conferences do want them. And this player certainly feels like he's the next up in the ACC. And that, of course, is Mr. Kyron Drones of Virginia Tech. Oops. Foreshadowing. Nope. Kyron Drones certainly made a name for himself last year in a very impressive way in a conference where, it's not necessarily the best of the Power 5, but it certainly has a duopoly at the top that no teams have really cracked. And if you want to beat Florida State and Clemson, you really have to bring an aura of surprise. You really have to bring an aura of superhuman abilities. And that's what I feel like Kyron Drones brings to the table. He's one of the more exciting, fascinating dual-threat quarterbacks that we've seen in college football in the past year. And this year certainly feels like now is his time to announce himself, because now it certainly feels like the ACC might be in a bit of turmoil, and who knows how it's going to look. Let's talk about Kyron Drones' season last year. 17-3 touchdown interception ratio, 2,903 all-purpose yards, and 818 of them were rushing yards for 5 TDs. So as you can see, the dual threat ability there. His best game was against Tulane, where he had 33.7 points. And the best part about this game was not his passing stats. He was only 13 of 21 for 91 yards for 2 TDs. It was his rushing ability. 20 carries, 176 yards, and 1 touchdown there. And so, if you want someone who's a dual-threat quarterback in fantasy college football, Kyron Drones might be your guy, because now there are no really big dual-threat QBs who I can see that are proven. Maybe Nico at Tennessee might prove to be one. Carson Beck really isn't one. Quinn Ewers might be, but who knows? Kyron Drones, at the end of the day, is the most exciting, and he A, plays in a very manageable conference, and B, most importantly, a conference where there's more parity than ever. And he returns, most importantly, his top 3 receivers in Daquan Felton, Jalen Lane, and Stephen Gosnell. And when I consider the outlook of the ACC this year, it's safe to say that a lot of people still believe that Florida State and Clemson are the cream of the crop. But, as we'll talk about in the next segment to close out the show, and with Clemson you really have two teams that don't feel as cemented in the roots of the ACC anymore as they have in the past. And the ACC certainly doesn't feel like a football powerhouse anymore now that both Florida State and Clemson aren't, on the periphery. We saw last year with Florida State, they still got snubbed despite being an undefeated season. Yes, it was kind of fate of circumstance they didn't have Jordan Travis there. But as you can see, perhaps the ACC is losing a bit of its luster. And so, if we look at other teams kind of on the periphery, on the outside looking in over the past, who haven't really stepped up, you might have actually thought of, say, Miami or North Carolina or teams of that nature, not necessarily Virginia Tech, because Virginia Tech hasn't necessarily been this exciting to talk about the prospect of them in quite some time. And what Kyron Jones brought last year was electricity. He brought excitement. He brought this kind of, I'm not going to say invincibility, because I do feel like Virginia Tech has a long way to go to actually truly cement itself. But he certainly feels like the kind of player who's announcing himself on the college football scene and on people's radars in terms of fantasy and college football combined. Now here's the thing about picking a guy like Kyron Jones, who perhaps was a complete unknown to most of you before this show. When I think about these guys who, like Kyron Jones, have been around the block a little bit, I feel like these are the guys who have learned more but haven't really shown that they can develop. Yes, they have had experience, in different places, understanding different cultures, different systems, but the fact that they've just been jumping around hasn't really helped them find a stabilized form of play. When I think about Kyron Jones, I do believe that he was a Baylor quarterback before, and in the short time I saw, I did not believe that this guy would be a star. Because what I saw out of him was a kind of timidity, a kind of glossed overness to him. A player who is just filling a role on a team that might not necessarily be competing. But when you move to a team like VTech, where a lot of pressure isn't on you necessarily, and they're more concerned about growing their program, that's when you really can become a quarterback. And that's what Kyron Jones did. That's what Kyron Jones really believed in. He believed in the fact that pressure might have been holding him back and not allowing him to really tap into the traits that make him a special player. And I'm not saying we were essentially robbed of fantastic play from Kyron Jones over the years, because no one truly expected him. But that's the beauty of college football. You can't always expect to know, oh, this quarterback's going to be fantastic this year. Oh, this quarterback's going to throw for over 3,000 yards this year. You can't always know what's going to happen at any given time in the landscape of college football. And so, when I'm dissecting a team like VTech and putting them up against other teams in the spotlight that they're kind of in, this is a team that can really focus on not just developing a guy like Kyron Jones, but focus on aspects outside of their control as well, like staying focused when there's so much turmoil going on in the ACC. If Virginia Tech really focuses on themselves rather than what's going on around them, then they are going to be perhaps the contender for the ACC title. I'm not saying with immediacy that they will be the ACC winner, but with all this talk about Florida State and Clemson, Virginia Tech has to feel as if all the attention on them really doesn't affect their style and what they want to do. That's always a positive thing if you're a program that's like Virginia Tech trying to get back to the highest of heights. And when I look at a quarterback like Kyron Drones, I look at a guy who, like I said, has been around the block in college football, has kind of had to find a path that suits him. I'm really intrigued to see if this success is something that can be a trend for him. Because if it is, then he's a very, very dangerous player and a sneaky proposition in terms of fantasy. Because it's one thing to have that kind of breakout season when no one's expecting it of you. It's quite another to do it, A, when you feel like you're a better team, and B, most importantly, in a conference where it certainly feels like it could be yours for the taking. And so, Drones is going to be a guy who a lot of people might gloss over still. But if you do choose to pick him up, I feel like the traits he brings to a fantasy college football team are the best traits you could ask for out of a quarterback. And if he really focuses on them, if he's really consistent in how he chooses to play, then he's a dream player for almost anyone concerned with the college football landscape, and especially a college fantasy football manager. But that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming up to close out the show, we do talk about DJ Uyunglele moving to Florida State. Can he prove to be someone you can trust in fantasy college football and perhaps in the future as he makes his NFL career? We'll have to find out after the break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and we conclude today's show with our last player profile of the day, talking about a guy that, unlike Kyron Drones, had a weird place in his career. Started off at Clemson, big hopes for him, didn't really cement himself as this guy who you could trust, so he transfers to Ohio State, tries to get more consistency, and while he did have a better season, he goes out, transfers to Florida State, and now on a team that's looking to have a level of consistency from last year and have it translate to this year. This quarterback certainly feels like he has more pressure on his shoulders than ever. Let's talk about the player profile of DJ Uyunglele. Now, DJ Uyunglele, when he first came into college football, had this aura about him where, of course, he was going to succeed because he was on Clemson, and Dabo Swinney really loves developing quarterbacks, having quarterbacks who can take you to the next level. So, that sense of inevitability to DJ Uyunglele's career I'm not sure whether or not it played a factor into what happened at Clemson and the struggles he had there, but it certainly feels like he hasn't necessarily shook them. Even at Oregon State, where he really kind of took the back seat a little bit and really focused on developing, and that's how he kind of improved. But now, by placing more weight on his shoulders by going to a Florida State team that was undefeated last year, felt they were snubbed, now it's a chip on its shoulder. It's definitely weird. And it's not the same Florida State team by any means. A lot of overhauls have taken place. No more Jordan Travis, so that's why DJ's there. No more, Trey Benson. No more Keon Coleman. No Johnny Wilson. So there's a lot of turnover to take care of if you're Mike Norvell in Florida State. And so the fact that DJ Uiagalelei is willing to go to a team that puts a lot more pressure on his shoulders than perhaps even Clemson did, and try and make it his own at a time when all the players who people and fans grew to love on this Florida State team are gone, it's very weird. And I feel like Florida State fans should be a little miffed about this, but here's why I feel like DJ has the traits. Last year, he wasn't flashy. He only had 2,638 yards, 21 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. He had a career high in passing yards, which is something that he can take away from this season. He had also had 219 rush yards and 6 TDs. His best game was 34.6 points in terms of fantasy against SJSU. 20 of 28, 239 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. His worst game, though, was against Washington. 9.9 touchdowns, 9.9 fantasy points, 15 of 31 passing yards, 164 yards, 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. And what I love about that kind of DJ Uiagalelei is someone who feels like he can turn a page. And if you're a Florida State fan, I don't think you should expect fireworks, but I don't think you should want to. You just want continuity. You just want a restart of a new season where anything is possible. And like I said, while there are certainly a lot of talk, or concerned with a lot of talk surrounding them leaving the ACC, you are also a team that can take advantage of the parity of the ACC. And while you don't necessarily have the players you once did, you did bring in transfers. You still have Lawrence Toafili, who, while only had 463 yards, 4 TDs, he's certainly someone who can grow into a new role. You bring in Ja'Kai Douglas, a transfer, a redshirt senior, Kenton Poirier, Deuce Spahn, guys who have been in this setup. And I really think that this Florida State team needs to really reinvent itself as something new. They can't dwell on 13-0 forever. Mike Norvell is going to want to preach that as well. I think he'll do a good job of that. But for DJ Uiagalelei, this certainly feels like it has to be a move where it's not just, I'm rounding out my college football career. I feel like I had one good season out of Oregon State, and I'm just here because I feel like I could turn a new page in my career and maybe get more attracted to NFL draft scouts. I certainly feel like DJ Uiagalelei has to take this year seriously, because all of Florida State is going to take the season seriously. If there's one single slip-up by DJ in this season, I think the fans won't let him have the end of it. And so that level of pressure can't necessarily feel good for DJ Uiagalelei, but here's how he can develop it and make it his own. In the course of last season for Florida State, I feel as if there were moments where they felt like they weren't as invincible as people thought. There were moments like against Boston College, they had to come back. There were moments, even when Jordan Travis was injured, that whole kind of conundrum where, the team did kind of lose sight of what they were doing. So, if Florida State, out of the blocks, does not perform up to par, and all the blame is on DJ, I feel like the best thing that DJ Youngaloole can do is absorb most of the blame himself. I know that sounds kind of weird because Mike Norvell really did an admirable job of bringing this team together after the frustration of last season. And he took most of the blame, when in fact he really shouldn't have. DJ needs to prove that he's moved past, the struggles, and he's accepting the role of Florida State quarterback and all the kind of challenges that brings with it. And saying that he has to confront them head on and attack because that's going to hurt more than help. But what I want out of DJ is a certain level of maturity that shows that this role is not just, a side project to get him to the NFL. This role is all about healing the wounds that Florida State had last year. Because the bottom line is, I think Florida State fans, aren't expecting a perfect season this year. They aren't expecting to capture lightning in a bottle again. But they are expecting a team that looks like it can get over that hump. A team that, while doesn't necessarily perform to a certain lofty standard that they set last year, can perform nonetheless. And won't have any letdowns in the process. Because at this moment in time, you look at teams in the ACC up and coming. You look at Virginia Tech, we just talked about. You look at Miami. You look at perhaps North Carolina can find something to get them back into the race. Florida State certainly feels like they're going to be treated as the hunted and no team is going to take pity on them. And so they have to be prepared for the challenges of overcoming the pratfalls of last season and really focusing on developing as a team. It all starts with DJ. Now let's talk about the caveats that DJ brings. When I think about him at Clemson, in the first game where he took over for Trevor Lawrence against Notre Dame, and he really showed that he could be a solid college football quarterback, I think that moment really didn't necessarily define why DJ Youngaloole was so hyped. And the reason that he was so hyped, because Clemson put a lot of hope and faith into him. They didn't want the whole scenario post Trevor Lawrence to be a huge mess. And so they really hoisted him up as the next big thing at Clemson. And that's where a lot of pressure came crashing down on him. By moving to Oregon State, I think it was a very astute and wise move for DJ. But it also added to the factor that maybe he was trying to run away from confronting what it really is to be a big-time program quarterback. And it's no offense to him by any means necessary. I respect the decision you make when you feel as if all this pressure's on your shoulders and you just want to move away. I get that. But it certainly now looks a bit more skeptical now that he's at Florida State than it would have been if, he had felt that Oregon State was the best fit for him. And maybe fate of circumstance led him there. Maybe Florida State and Mike Norvell said, hey, I feel that DJ's the right way to go in terms of replacing Jordan Travis. And who knows, maybe that could ring true. But as of right now, the expectations for DJ Youngaloole is just to be someone who's mature enough. And it certainly feels like throughout his college career, there's been too much chaos to really prove that he can be a guy who can lead a big-time program to the promised land. And it's no diss whatsoever, no disrespect to DJ. I truly feel that he can be a solid player. He has fantastic traits that really haven't realized. If he does realize them, then the sky's the limit for the kid. But I feel that this season is more important about realizing what it takes, because Jordan and Travis left an indelible mark on this program. And if DJ Youngalola can't kind of pick up those pieces that he left behind, then Florida State really will have to worry more about themselves rather than the bigger picture, which is getting back to where they need to be. If they get lost in all of that, then I don't know what to feel. But DJ Youngalola is certainly a very interesting fantasy proposition. Now that's about to do it for today's show. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to this show and the network. Also, if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. That will change in the future, and you will make yourselves available to all of the new and exciting things you can use to communicate with me throughout my show as I go live. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for talking. I'm really excited for the next episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow.